From time to time, it is important to review and to consider the conclusions of others upon the same material and what other material that you draw in. It's also important to have a concept of what summaries and such are out there so that you can share, because we shouldn't just sit on knowledge, especially the knowledge that pertains to morals, ethics, and spirituality beyond what mainstream society is telling us. Now, sometimes mainstream society can be right, but it's not about whether it is mainstream or not. Some people will take the adversarial or the accepting approach for itself, regardless of what things are. A lot of so-called contemporary issues will seem redundant, but perhaps a way of phrasing a conclusion or an expression of an idea may reach another way that it hasn't before. Or perhaps we just need to keep learning about and practicing these things. And I'm generally going to skip over, the events at the start of this century and the 1984 and onwards narrative of so-called Islamic terrorism and where that originates from, because it's better to just know what religion itself teaches, rather than focusing on events that may not be known about or thought about by those who are going to listen to you when they decide to listen to you, since now everything is recorded. It can be said that the Friday or the holiday sermons are to convey of the revelation, of the inspiration, and a contemporary understanding. We need to not make things about sects. Everybody has the effort of what they have. If we turn to the fundamentals rather than so-called orthodoxy, then we have the fountainhead of all the benefits of the various sectarian factions at our hands. Islam is not a religion that is interested in left-wing equity. We are individuals that favor meritocracy. The beliefs and actions of an individual is where their true status lies. And this is tempered based on what people have. And if people want to change their condition, they got to change it for themselves. None of this messianic, complex stuff where they wait for just some great leader to come. Society has to be such that will follow the leader, if that's what we're talking about. To accomplish the same, as long as it's right, we are individuals of the path of least effort. It is acceptable to have certain terms or expressions that are new, but they need to be in the context of what is revealed and inspired, because we have a complete system these days for that. We don't believe in valid religions before, after, or during what is called in Arabic Islam, which is surrender or submission, to God, Allah, the singular and definitive term for God. But we do acknowledge the good and truth of all paths and all people. The prophets were not infallible, but they were innocent. And that's why they were so great, because they could have made mistakes, but they didn't. And God chose the best of individuals to carry on the divine messages that they were inspired with, that were revealed to them. We believe in the absolute oneness and the absolute unity of God, not being limited in any way like unto the creation, and that the qualities are as such that they work together. The essence, we don't talk about the essence. All forms belong to God, but we don't point to any particular place or individual and speak of incarnations or any of that sort of stuff. We don't label God with gender. In Islam, the ideal is to not believe or act until we know what the command of God is in that respect. Surah 21, ayat 26 and 27 backs that up. Surah 3:7 indicates that we should not follow the opinion of the sectarians, and that we should follow the opinion that is grounded in the knowledge. So none of this baseless speculation and trying to seek out weird symbolic meanings of things. Certainly in Islam, what we have, especially when we turn to the Quran, is something we can believe in literally, and other connections other than just the pure linguistic reference, those can be in agreement with that. But we need to do this with knowledge, not by saying someone or some path somewhere has come to the same. And a lot of criticisms of Islam come from criticisms of Christianity or Judaism that may be legitimate, or something about animism, and something similar is done by the Muslims, so they must mean it the same way. And it's like, we don't always mean things the same way. Like the people who wear North African clothes, they're not doing that as some sort of if they dress a certain way, it's going to ward off spirits. Modesty is one thing we employ, and that has nothing to do with climate or whatever. Certain styles may vary because of climate, but you know what I mean. And by God owning all the forms, God has the ruling will. So therefore, miracles and all that are done by the permission of God. And, I mean, if we're going to bounce this off the Bible really doesn't have Jesus do anything that no one else does. A Muslim is one who became such by choice, and, they go take a full bath afterwards, right? And they are considered as innocent of all their previous deeds. Certainly their good deeds from the past count for them. There's particularly importance on people of previous religions because they believe in the good of what they were part of and the fuller truth. So there's a greater reward for those sorts of people accepting. Because it can be hard. I was raised to be an LDS missionary, and I was I didn't go on a 2-year mission, but I brought people towards the church. I shared about the Book of Mormon with my friends. So it wasn't easy stepping away from that, particularly how family can react to that sort of thing. And of course, there are other ways to have all your sins forgiven. There's the pilgrimage, and there's the going off to war. But the war is done in the cause of God. It's not some war of conversion like you hear about in the Bible and Crusader literature or modern society, how they say they're going to spread democracy when America was never a democracy, which is kind of a funny one, right? After the testimony of faith that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his servant and messenger, a Muslim needs to pray the 5 orisons in the evening, between dusk and dawn, between dawn and sunrise, in the early afternoon and the late afternoon. There's the obligatory alms. If you have a certain amount of wealth, you give a 40th of your savings every year. And what is this, 20 pieces of silver, so about $400 or something like that. And there's also, at the end of Ramadan, if you can afford it, 4 heaping handfuls of grain or nuts or fruit or something like that. And if you can't afford it, you give a portion of it. Maybe you just break off a piece of fruit and give that in charity. Or you can give the equivalent of food, because the money from the food. And just like the sacrifice, you don't have to physically do that yourself. You can do that overseas at maybe even a tenth the price that it is done in one's particular country. A lot of that depends, but so that's something to consider too, is if you can afford it, that may be tempered through, well, can you afford giving $40, but you can't afford giving $500? Okay, well, then you give $40. But you accomplish the same thing, and the whole animal's given. But the whole animal doesn't have to be given if it's done in person. From dawn, which is on average an hour and a half before sunrise, to sunset, there's the fasting from eating, drinking, injections, that sort of stuff, the sexual acts during the 9th month, which is interesting because in the Bible, the 9th month is also such a month of fasting. But in Islam, the requirement is not to read through the entire scripture at night or to say it in prayers. It's nice to do that, but it's not required. And it's also better to do this at home than to do this in the group. Now, if it's going to be done, it's going to be done, right? Because there's nothing wrong with saying your recommended prayers at the masjid. It's just better to say them at home. And then, of course, we have the pilgrimage to Mecca. And that's done from the 8th to the 13th of the 12th month of the year. Not December, the sacred year. And that's done with particular rituals and in particular ways. And interestingly enough, a lot of that is actually literally supported by the Bible and some other religious texts. And belief is considered more essential than action, but of course action is implied by the beliefs. Certainly we believe in God. We believe in the light beings or unfallen angels. I say unfallen angels because, let's face it, the word angel refers to the malaika, the jinn. It could refer to some bad people or a kid, or it may not have that meaning. So we're referring to the spiritual levels of existence. So I say the fire beings and the light beings, but the light beings is what you believe in. We believe the fire beings exist, but that's not a pillar of faith, right? We believe that in the prophets, we believe in the revelations that they received. Not all of them were written down as books per se, but we refer to them with a word that sort of translates as book. We believe in Judgment Day and we believe in fate, but we are not fatalist. Everybody's responsible for what they believe. Some translations are going to have some phrases that are not quite right, like saying that God misleads and stuff like this. Actually, literally, they're not taking in the guidance of God, so there's that choice. And if they're not taking in some guidance, other guidance won't be available. So there's phrases like that, and it's not saying that God lets anybody go astray, unless you're saying that, well, God lets you make a choice, and, that sort of thing. But God doesn't burden us beyond what we can bear, so, And by our belief in the prophets and their scriptures, we don't believe everything that is claimed about scriptures. I talk about what has been interpolated, what is representation, what is reworking, and all that other stuff of previous scriptures. I make my arguments about how this couldn't have originated in this language and that sort of stuff elsewhere. But what we believe in is what came through the prophets themselves. Now, sometimes the language, we kind of lose the language and things are so ambiguous. I recently recorded a program where in this program, things were left kind of open, and and in some cultures, certain things happened. So you really needed more information than was in the verse to translate the verse in a way that was going to let you know what the verse meant. I did give the literal meaning of the verse, but, and no, I'm not talking about the Quran or the Hadith. And that's one of the things we actually, better than the Greek of the Bible, we know what things mean. The prophets of God were not philosophers. They didn't come with they didn't derive out their own doctrines. They didn't, it's what they were sent with. Even the Bible says that about Jesus. It's like, wait, if Jesus didn't speak his own doctrine, and he speaks the doctrine of the one who sent him, so he was a Rasulullah, that throws the whole divinity thing out the window, doesn't it? Of course, we believe that everything counts, so the Day of Judgment is about that. And, well, why doesn't it happen at death? It's like, well, how can the energy, legacy, and memory after you die be testified about if the judgment is at death? So then nobody has to just take the word that, oh, well, this is going to be the influence. It's like, no, it's going to be actually witnessed before you were judged. Government in the Islamic world can be said to be according to different types, you could say, but the Islamic world and a Muslim majority aren't the same thing. So when we look at some of these areas, and they aren't ruled by an Islamic constitution, they aren't ruled by consensus, because a constitutional democracy, for example, is right of center. A constitutional republic is left of center. True right wing is lesser government control. True left wing is greater government control, less freedom, that sort of stuff. So, I'm not talking about this, the aisles of the uniparty and all this stuff. And things are open publicly. So it's not an authoritarian state, again, so it's a right-wing thing. And religion is not enforced. It does matter if you testify that you are in agreement with the underlying principles of the state. You know, people make all sorts of issues. It's not prejudice to give different people different opportunity because of what they claim. Since we only worship God, we don't take part in sorcery. We don't pick things up to chance. We're doing our acts of worship according to guidance. And we're not involving, we don't shuffle a deck of cards to tell the future. We don't invoke other entities. We don't evoke other entities. We stir up feelings in ourselves and those present, certainly, but we don't, in that sense, the people who think, oh, I must have a mala of Tulsi beads to do this. It's like, you don't. And that's the great thing about Islam, is it breaks that faith in the objects by you can just do whatever with what's at hand. And it's like you don't need an object to count your remembrance. You can count on your fingers if you feel like counting. Because certainly, like after the prayer, you want to do something consistent. So doing things according to the traditional number and stuff, that can be important. The state does and should regard the business agreements. But people of different religions, they can get married, there are certain conditions that too, of course. But you know what I mean? Those contracts are largely not the state's business, but if the economic or whatever aspect of that is not upheld, then it can be brought before a judge. But otherwise, the government just stays involved in, what hurts other individuals. They'll react against that, slander and other such things. And that includes political slander. You can't just go around repeating bad things about people. It's like if you don't know the proofs, you should stay silent about your criticism of individuals. Such and such came forward, such and such, that sort of, but it's like, well, why aren't they charged? Oh, there wasn't enough evidence to even consider that. Okay, then, really just drop it. And when it comes to politics, you don't pick things because you like it. You pick it because it's the right thing. Same thing with your actions. You may not like what is good, but it may be the best thing. And in the long run, you're going to like it. Especially when you regard the afterlife, right? The Quran was learned word for word, much like other scriptures, and conveyed as such. And it took Muhammad till the end of his life to learn it. And the last Ramadan of his life, which was the 10th year, Al-Hijrah. I'm recording this in 1446, by the way. It was said twice. People learned the order and other such details about the Quran and its context as it came down. And it's important, I would say, that we don't go all sectarian when it comes to the translations. We should convey literal meanings, contextual meanings, based on the evidence, not on one's unsubstantiated opinions. The Quran is a summary of all good and truth, to encourage it and to discourage or condemn all evil and ignorance, and anything that I've ever thought of that could be referred to it for spiritual guidance, or anybody has ever mentioned to me, you can turn to the Quran, which makes it quite unique. You look at the Native American stuff, the Buddhist, the Indian, the all sorts of other stuff, you're not going to find the full picture. You're going to find a lot of stuff, but in Islam you find it all in one place. And when I tap this, it's just a habit, because I'm not. But imagine that I'm tapping a Quran as my reference, right? There are many narrators about what happened with Prophet Muhammad. In the Sunni tradition, we have some big collections: Muslim, Bukhari, Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Nasa'i, Imam Malik, and even the weakest of hadith regarding Prophet Muhammad is stronger than almost anything you'll see in other religious traditions. I was raised LDS, and they have edited their scripture. And considering that everything was supposed to be directly sanctioned by God, even spelling and grammatical errors shouldn't have existed in the transcription. But it goes even deeper than that, the changes that have been made. Even the 2013 versus the 1981 one has undergone some changes. And I don't know if I'll point out all of those, but I've certainly pointed out 1830 to 1981, and I could point out the other three directly Joseph Smith inspired, supposedly inspired editions. Now, inspiration in a religious sense is not that you get an idea and you write a book that makes it seem like how you would be as a good Christian and all that other stuff. That sort of effort, like composing this book we have before us, can be a good thing to have, but, it's not the same thing as spiritual inspiration. Islam is a complete life. So war and all that are mentioned. But people like to take things out of context if they're going to either do bad or they're going to accuse others of bad. If you look at what are called the 165 jihad verses and the 43 ghazawat, you do not find the injustices you expect with war. It's all defensive wars. No one's fighting for land. No one's fighting for treasure. No one's fighting to make slaves or force conversion. People may get motivated towards conversion, but not by force. And that's an extra, a great extra, greater than the other three extras that we have just brought up. But certainly they are extras. They are not the purpose of war. We don't fight people because they're disbelievers or apostates or they blasphemed. Certainly we consider that stuff worse than the other sins, but it's up to God, right? If we follow the basic 5 pillars, or, in other words, do the minimum of what has been obliged on us, even if we skip out on all the recommended, on all the voluntary, on making things personal, trying to experience things, sharing, that sort of stuff, we will be successful. Now, but you want to thrive, not just survive spiritually, don't you? We don't say that God rests. We don't say God's like one of us or any of that stuff. An image belonging to God, even you look at the biblical reference and you take it back, you realize it's not saying that anybody looks like God. It's that there's this image belonging to God. Like people would stare off into dark mirrors, reflective surfaces of various sorts, and they would have visions. And that's sort of where that came from. And basically, the image belongs to God. It's not God. Because something else, you know, your reflection disappears and you see something else if you're standing close enough to it. But we don't even get into that. So certain ways of describing things are not there. So we don't get, just like a lot of traditions talk about becoming a child of God, are a child in a non-literal sense. And over time, that can lead to a lot of confusion, right? Our purpose, and the purpose of the fire beings, is to serve God, to worship God, as has been prescribed. And no one could do it for us. But we can do everything that is required of us ultimately, and more. The prophet of the international age fulfills stuff that survives from previous ages. But let's not fall under the illusion that we should wait and comment based on these corrupted scriptures that exist. Certainly, we can use them as proofs towards these things. That, hey, it said here too, it can be used to invite people towards Islam as the fulfillment of Islam in previous ages. To have some knowledge of Islam makes a lot of things a lot more understandable once we know, whether it be Jewish or Christian sources, Zoroastrian, so-called, and so-called Hindu, Chinese, European. It all seems to be a lot more understandable once we know the Islamic perspective. There is probably more about Prophet Muhammad than any other pre-modern figure. And we can also say that it's conveyed a lot more reliably. There are some issues that form difficulties for some people, but those issues, we know that they are weak. And if we look at the context, this person had more detail, which gives you a whole different age, whole different perspective, that sort of stuff as you go into that. People look at the reaction with other communities. Muhammad didn't persecute those who falsely claimed to be prophets. He didn't try to force the Jews or anybody else to accept Islam. He invited everybody, and that's what you do. Even to the point where if it seems there has to be war, try inviting them towards Islam, and that will put an end to it. If they accept. If they don't accept, then, But it's not letters are sent out, and it's accept Islam or we're going to come kill you if you or conquer you or whatever. That's not the case. I guess people could fragment that in some weird way that would come to, lead to that conclusion, but you're not going to find that in the Hadith or Quran. If you finish the passage right. On the 10th of the 12th month, there is a holiday sermon, and the last holiday sermon of Muhammad's life was very particularly remembered, and it was reminded that he was going to leave the Quran intact and, his tradition. And as long as we adhere to these, things are going to be fine. Well, we're going to succeed spiritually. It's not quite appropriate to say Muhammad had a concubine or a pre-adolescent wife that he consummated things with, because the evidence kind of goes against that. Contextually, as I said with the other, the one person who said 9 and everybody goes through that. Well, when he was younger, he said 19, which in Arabic is one more word. And everything that guy said when he was older has been graded weak because that wasn't the only thing the guy fragmented. And there's context in Bukhari and some other stuff that indicates that that can't possibly be the thing. Now, the marriage was arranged when she was 6, according to most of the narrations that get into that. But you can, in my country, you can arrange a marriage before people are even born or even conceived. So, there's no legality or morality issue with that. A lot of people like to read in their own things the current laws are this. It's like, don't wait for your country to legalize or illegalize something. Don't be a sociopath. It's like drug use. Islam was ahead of the game. You didn't need to see, well, is this drug illegal or is this recommended for this, that, or the other? It's like, well, if it's needed for survival, it's needed for survival. But don't look for an excuse for stuff, right? And like even in the Bible, what's rendered as a concubine is usually, a wife. Not the main wife, but still a wife. So Muhammad wasn't, there wasn't sex slaves or any of this other stuff that people think. Like people that get their Islam off Fox News or something like that might join some Mossad-led Daesh organization or some other group like that and think that, they get the, see, that's where they get it from. So popular and political Islam, we need to step aside from that because they're not actual Islam. There may be things that agree with that, like people say they're Sufi. It's like, well, there's a link to Islam, but how much of it is Islamically sound? A Muslim protects everybody's place of worship. They protect all the spiritual communities, their honor, their life, family, mentality, property. That is all important. Now, by honor, I don't mean someone disrespects you or disrespects the family or their behaviors bring shame on the family. No, we don't take part in that. And wait, that's most of it's done by Americans? I thought that, so you look into that and, religious law, when we don't limit it to some ruling of some sheikh, is very expansive. What is revealed and what has been inspired to the international prophet, as we're supposed to follow it when we get to that. We're not supposed to wait till some sheikh approves of it. So therefore, that just opens to all of life. So when we talk about religious law, we just apply that to justice wherever justice is. And sometimes it's not for us to mention the religious connection. We make that internally. But certainly our politics in the non-Islamic state, which happens to be all of them, by the way, is in that respect. Now, there's Abadi and Shia sources and stuff like this, but this is a Sunni book, so we're going to put this on the Sunni list, and we're not going to get into that. So in the Sunni perspective, we have the sources of law as the Quran, what Muhammad said or did, or something related to that, right? Directly. The consensus. The Quran talks about the way of the believers. So the Sunnis tend to look at the first 3 or 4 generations and say, well, did they have this opinion? Well, technology has changed a lot. Some terminology that explains some of these things may not have existed at that time. That doesn't mean it's a sinful innovation. Certainly you can't look at any scholar later than a couple hundred years after Muhammad died and say, oh, it's wrong because he didn't phrase it exactly the same way. No, we shouldn't get involved in that sort of stuff. The personal analogy, reasoning, etc. But as it said, philosophy is not just some random wandering of opinion like some who speak of philosophy is. We need to filter our philosophy. And when others are in authority over us in some way, we certainly need to have regard of that. Now, that doesn't mean that those in authority over us can do what is not right, that they can do what is not fair. Like some people with old world opinions will say, well, you have to obey your parents even if they're wronging you. It's like, no, you don't. That's a biblical teaching, but not a Quranic teaching. Pauline specifically. Life, in a way, is an open book test, so you can turn around and refer to things to the Quran. And the other sources of law, you can see how those other three directly relate to the first, the Quran, these Quraniyun people. It's not that there's issues with it's issues with the people want their own authority structure and they want to work their way up. You look at the Quran-only people, that's what those people did. They worked their way up towards claims about themselves. And the real issues were not with the Quran or the authentic narrations. The issues were with some of the rulings. And I do agree there are some issues with the ruling. So when you have a ruling, you think, why? That's the problem asking sometimes. If you're asking an opinion for some more information, people don't say why, and it's important to say why. That's why I have so many videos on my channel, right? It's giving you the why. And you've seen at least some of what's on my bookshelf, so you know other sources that maybe I haven't spoke about yet that are going into things. And certainly there's the wholesome, which may pertain to your material culture, your ancestry, and that's perfectly fine. But as far as what the Prophet has said is lawful, you accept that, and what's unlawful, you leave that. And you may find reasons to have faith later, but certainly you need to start with belief sometimes. But, we don't come into Islam or we don't stay in Islam because it's just being passed around. We are commanded to think about these things. Religion does apply to the changing situations, but popularity and all that sort of stuff doesn't change anything but like traffic and safety laws, right? Our clothing may be made with technology that is different. Like some people will say that like black and white and green and brown are the only colors you can wear as a male. But that's not true. Like orange. They would say, it's like clothes dyed in saffron. Well, okay, if that's limited to women and you don't have stuff dyed in urine and you don't have stuff dyed in blood, so the reds and the purples and stuff and even some of the black, but but those colors aren't forbidden. So there's just certain stuff that is forbidden. And, things being, it's more popular now, so we just, step aside. And we find more and more why adultery and or fornication or all sorts of other stuff, it's just not good for society. We may have been able to get away with stuff not too long ago. In my country, forced marriage was completely acceptable. It was generally not the thing, but it was definitely heard of. If you hadn't seen it done, it was something that both men and women would be forced into. Now, Islam was ahead of the game and said, no, we need consent. Medina became a sacred site, and Jerusalem was relegated to the third most important sacred site. And people talk about Masjid al-Aqsa or the Dome of the Rock or that sort of thing. Masjid al-Aqsa is the hill. It's not a specific building. The Holy Land is spoken of favorably in Quran, and there's definitions for that. But the Roman term of Palestine was not mentioned by Muhammad. It was known by Palestine. But perhaps Muhammad knew what that meant. The wallowers for the she Satan. It's like that wasn't the thing. How can a Muslim accept that title for a place? Just like a person who has a bad name, when they accept Islam, they can change their name. But not everybody has to change their name. I personally go by a name religiously and publicly. but I haven't legally changed my name. And of course, you don't dox people, thank you very much. But, we don't feel like we have to have Arab culture or Arab names. You may want to know how to say your name in Arabic. Medina and Mecca, which are, again, two of the three places that one can go on a pilgrimage. Not the Great Pilgrimage is only in Mecca, but they are said to be places where the false Messiah is not going to be able to enter. And the false Messiah, again, we have our choices of beliefs, no matter what At-Dajjal or the system of At-Dajjal does. We will remain with the ability to do what's right according to our physical and mental means. Islam didn't allow people to go off and conquer because they were looking for, their claim was, well, these were sacred sites, so we should be in charge. But we should, but that's not how. Zechariah 14, for example, brings up that it wasn't war, but there's going to be something from the Arabs that lasts, and that remains to the end of time. But again, it's not about Arab ways or something like that. It's something greater. In the New Testament, they talk about how the Israelites were going to lose the prophethood, and it was going to be returned upon the people with the rock in the corner. And Mecca was one of the three sacred sites in the Bible. Mecca, Jerusalem, and Shiloh. Of course, Jerusalem and Shiloh were considered of primacy of that time, but, we don't find problems with that certain things were of different conditions. Like, who knows what some of that stuff in the Bible was. It could have been required not to wear mixed fabrics. You could have had to wear a blue or purple thread, because that blue and purple thread indicated that you weren't a Satanist, or, and whatever the actual reasons, but, historically that's what it looks like it could have been. Who knows about the mixed fabric? I haven't made sense of that, or I don't remember making sense of it anyways. When it comes to jihad, Islam has this opinion that the greater struggle, the greater striving, is that of your own character. It's living the good life. And the outer struggle almost never turns into war. You can say stuff, you can change things with your hands, but if you have to go to war, it's not some anti-environment thing. It's you protect. You're avoiding the animals. You're avoiding the innocents. As I said before, you're protecting the places of worship. There's a whole list of things we can go into elsewhere, but I'm trying to do a singular sermon on this book of 400 pages. Marriage is half of religion, so family life is essential, but that doesn't mean that you need to compromise with your family when it comes to what is right. And so your own personal taste, everybody has their own personal taste and all that other stuff too, so there's more than that. It's what's fair. Marriage isn't the same as a civil union, so there are certain conditions to it. And one of those conditions is a waiting period. So let's not hear any of this nonsense where people are going to have temporary marriage after temporary marriage after temporary marriage, because the woman has to wait and wait and wait and wait, so she can't just, go through 10 guys a month or a season or even a year. And we're not allowed to have temporary as the intention. Certainly the enjoyment marriage can take place, but that's because the enjoyment has been had and things didn't work out, and then each goes their own way. There's not the intention of it. Like the person who gets married to somebody so that a marriage, that somebody can go and marry another person again when they were married before. See, that's a cursed marriage if their intention was that it wasn't going to be. So, if even to restore that aspect of a relationship is a cursed marriage, how can you do it when it's just, I feel like being married for a couple hours this weekend or for the weekend, or I have a week off in June, so I'm going to be married for a week in June, and then I'm going to, no. That's got to be even more cursed, right? Marriage is about producing and maintaining a family on the worldly sphere. So if it's detached from that, everyone's responsible for themselves, and that includes the results that affects others. And when there is a marriage, one of the things, now, a lot of scholars are going to say that after the first marriage, a woman doesn't have to have a guardian who takes testimony that's, yes, this is what she really wants, and it's in her interests. The Wally, some people will say that it's not obliged, but I think that's jurisprudence. I don't know of anything other than jurisprudence that's saying that. I don't know of any narration or Quranic verse. Certainly some things that are legal in America as far as who you can marry, whether it's the relationship that they had with you or someone else that you know, or whether it's how closely related they are to you. Islam does better than that. The secular states do with that. People are married according to Quran and Sunnah. There's not a secret marriage. So a guy doesn't have a second family and the wife doesn't know about it. So marriages are a public thing. It's not you're sneaking off and eloping. Sometimes the families don't give permission and there's allowances for that, but it's not, like that. And the families aren't supposed to stop a good marriage from happening just because they want certain social or economic things to take place as part of it. In Islam, we don't adopt. We're honest about the lineage as far as we can. We can take care of people. But the inheritance and other aspects of being of the direct family are not as such. There's a limit to how much you can will to others outside the normal relations of inheritance. The different circles, and there's different ways that you treat different groups around you of how closely you're related, and then your friends and the greater society. Everybody has some sort of right upon you. And so there's a sort of natural hierarchy to things. Primates, humans are a type of primate, by the way, operate according to a patriarchal hierarchy. Islam, it's not a prejudice against women. Certainly women have rights. Like, for example, the rights are like unto men. They're not exactly the same in all ways, but overall there's an equalness. It's harder to see at first glance that the women just don't have an advantage over the men in Islam, but it seems to even itself out if you look at the overall view. And everybody, part of the great thing about family is the influence that you have. Whatever good you're encouraging, whatever bad you're discouraging, that's it. It counts for you. And that's why people even talk about not having children as being cut off. But that, of course, doesn't mean you just get married because getting married is an option. You need to get married according to the Quran and the Sunnah. These days, people talk a lot about gender and racial issues and all sorts of stuff like that. By and large, that social justice warrior stuff is fake. It's not based on any real cause. And I mean the environment and stuff too. Certainly we are good about the environment. We're good about the animals and all that sort of stuff in Islam. So we don't need to look at things, that way. And we respect people for their differences, white people and Northern Asians stay warmer in the winter easier, but black and brown people don't get sunburned like white people do. So we all have our strengths here, and they don't get overheated as easy and all that stuff. So we're not downing or upping anybody by that alone. Some of those factors can be used to help divide up work and all that stuff. Some people are stronger or skilled in this way or another. Everybody has their place in society. And as far as what was done in previous generations in particular, let's just leave it and move on with the equal rights that we have now and claim our rights in society. And what was owed from unlawful employment and stuff like that before, we just drop that stuff. And we try to avoid unknown consumption of wealth or food or whatever. But as far as what is best, we take part in what is best. We're not like, okay, here's an unlawful thing in the dish and we just pick out that. No, it's the whole dish is not lawful. You can't cook with beer or wine and to the point where it's non-alcoholic and then say, oh, well, it's fine, or pick out the pork out of the piece of pork out of the pork and beans, the flavors throughout the pot. That alone should tell you that. And the potentials of, we're not doing things just because of the physical side. We can look into some of that for health reasons. And there are some contemporary issues about, just like the drug thing or the food thing or whatever. If it's needed to survive and you're only doing it to survive, not because, I just want a little bit of comfort food or comfort, whatever. I hurt, but I don't need it to eat or survive. Then don't take the painkiller. And honestly, trust me, from my pre-Islamic days, you take all the medication they tell you, it almost never makes your life better. Now you can get over a cold or something like that, and even then, it's just tends to be a better way. But as said in the channel, warning, I'm giving spiritual advice. Accept the science. The actual science, not what does the corporate sponsor say? Oh, I wonder what ads show up with my channel. Ahl Dhimma have rights. We could easily say that they have more rights in an actual Islamic society than the secular societies have. And their right to protection makes insurance and some other unlawful spending and earning and that sort of stuff unnecessary. And taxes are overall lower for a non-Muslim in a Muslim state than they'd expect to find in any secular state or under their own religious rule. Certainly people are allowed enough control of their money. They're not taxed to the point where they can't give alms if they don't want to get alms. And it's certainly a society that doesn't overtax via the government. There is the encouragement of doing good for others, doing good to the neighbors and all that. And might want to say something about the stock market. So Islamically, we have that you can't value something based on speculation of the future. So advertising of the Super Bowl, driving up the price of stocks, earnings going down and the price of stocks going up, that sort of stuff shows the stock market isn't lawful. There is ways of dividing companies that are lawful. As said before, Islam is accepting of all science. What people do about science, that may be a different matter. We don't change the creation, and that includes even decorative altering of the teeth and stuff like that. So certainly genetic modification of food and that sort of stuff would not be lawful. What choice do we have is what choice we have, but you're given an equivalent opportunity that you can afford, you should choose not to take part in that. Remember to allow medical freedom and to minimize harm.